Most people think ignoring someone means you are weak. They believe silence means you lost the argument. They believe walking away means you had nothing intelligent to say. And because of this belief, people rush to defend themselves, they rush to respond, they rush to prove their point. But this instinct creates one of the most common psychological traps in human interaction. The moment you react emotionally, you surrender control of the situation, because the person who provoked you was never really looking for the truth. They were looking for a reaction, a raised voice, an angry reply, a defensive explanation, anything that proves they successfully entered your mind. Most people do not realize that provocation is a psychological fishing hook. The words are only the bait. The real objective is to pull you into emotional engagement, and the moment you bite, the dynamic changes. Now you are no longer observing the situation. You are inside it. You are defending yourself, explaining yourself, reacting to every move they make. Meanwhile, the other person is quietly watching something very important: how easily they can control your emotional state. This is exactly why the person who reacts first usually loses, because reaction transfers power. It tells the other person that they have access to your mind. But centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli observed something very different about human behavior. He understood that power in social dynamics is rarely about aggression, volume, or argument. It is about control of attention and emotion. And sometimes the most powerful move is not confrontation. It is strategic silence. When you refuse to react, when you remain calm, when you deny someone the reaction they expected, something unusual begins to happen. The person who tried to provoke you starts losing control of their own emotions. Not because you attacked them, not because you defeated them in an argument, but because you refused to participate in the psychological game they created. Silence does something very uncomfortable to the human mind. It creates uncertainty, and uncertainty destabilizes people far more than confrontation ever could. In this video, we are going to break down 7 deep psychological mechanisms inspired by Machiavellian thinking that explain why ignoring someone strategically can completely reverse the power dynamic in an interaction. You will understand why silence can frustrate manipulators, destabilize provocateurs, and quietly shift authority back into your hands. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is not the loudest one. It is the one who cannot be emotionally pulled into the fight. Before we begin, I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. Silence is power. Let's get started. Number 1. The psychological mirror break. Human beings constantly search for signs that they matter inside other people's minds. Every comment, every insult, every subtle challenge carries an invisible expectation behind it, a reaction. The reaction acts like a mirror. When someone provokes you and you respond with anger, they immediately see proof that their words affected you. When you defend yourself, they see confirmation that their opinion holds weight. When you argue back, they see that they successfully entered your mental space. In other words, your response reflects their influence. This is why provocateurs often watch your face more than they listen to your words. They are not just speaking, they are measuring impact. But the moment you refuse to react, something unusual happens inside the psychological structure of the interaction. The mirror breaks. Suddenly, the person who expected to see their influence reflected back sees nothing. No anger, no defense, no visible emotional disturbance. Their words disappear into silence. At first, this silence confuses them. They expected friction, they expected resistance. Instead, they encounter absence. And the human mind is extremely uncomfortable with absence where it expected impact. The brain immediately begins searching for explanations. Did they ignore me intentionally? Did they not hear me? Are they stronger than I thought? Did I miscalculate this person? Uncertainty begins to replace confidence. A moment earlier, they believed they understood the dynamic between you. They believed they had emotional access to you, but without the mirror of your reaction, their sense of control collapses. This is where the psychological fracture begins forming. People rely heavily on feedback to measure their influence over others. A leader looks for signs of attention. A critic looks for signs of defense. A provocateur looks for signs of irritation. When none of these signals appear, the brain loses its measurement system. Imagine speaking into a room where every sound you make produces no echo. At first, it feels strange. After a moment, it becomes unsettling. That is exactly what psychological silence does to someone attempting to provoke you. The absence of reaction forces them to confront a possibility they did not anticipate. They may not matter in your mental world, and this realization destabilizes many people more than confrontation ever could. Confrontation still acknowledges their presence. Silence quietly erases it. This is why experienced strategists rarely rush to respond to every attack or insult. They understand that attention itself is a form of currency. Every reaction you give invests energy into the interaction. Every defense confirms that the other person successfully entered your focus. But silence withdraws that investment completely. The provocateur is left speaking into an empty psychological space. And empty space has a powerful effect on human perception. It magnifies doubt. The person begins replaying the moment repeatedly in their mind, searching for clues about what went wrong. They may try again with stronger words. They may raise their voice. They may become more aggressive. But none of these attempts restore the mirror they lost. Instead, they begin exposing their own need for validation. Meanwhile, you remain calm, emotionally stable, and psychologically distant. This contrast creates an invisible shift in perception for anyone observing the interaction. One person appears composed and unmoved. The other appears increasingly desperate for acknowledgement. And that difference quietly alters the power dynamic without a single argument being spoken. Machiavelli once said, "He who controls himself controls the field of power." True influence often comes not from what you say, but from what you refuse to react to. When someone cannot see their influence reflected in you, they begin confronting something far more uncomfortable than resistance. They confront irrelevance, and very few people know how to handle that feeling without losing their composure. Now, I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I control my reactions. Number 2. Status ambiguity. Every interaction between two people contains a silent calculation that most individuals never consciously notice. Beneath the words, beneath the tone of voice, beneath the visible behavior, the human brain is constantly evaluating one question: who holds the higher psychological position here? This evaluation happens automatically. It happens in business meetings, casual conversations, disagreements, and even simple social exchanges. People measure confidence, emotional stability, and reactions in order to determine where everyone stands in the invisible hierarchy of the moment. The strange part is that most people reveal their position without realizing it. When someone insults them and they rush to defend themselves, they unintentionally signal that the other person's opinion carries weight. When they react with anger, they show emotional involvement. When they start explaining themselves repeatedly, they communicate that the accusation has entered their mind deeply enough to require correction. These reactions appear normal on the surface, But psychologically, they give the other person information. They reveal that the provocation successfully created engagement. Engagement confirms that the interaction matters to you. And once the interaction matters to you, the other person knows they have influence over your emotional focus. But something very different happens when you respond with calm indifference or strategic silence. Instead of confirming the hierarchy, you introduce uncertainty into it. The other person cannot easily determine why you ignored them. Did you stay silent because you felt intimidated? Or did you stay silent because the interaction was beneath your attention? The mind immediately tries to resolve this question, but the absence of clear signals prevents an easy answer. This creates what psychologists often describe as status ambiguity. The hierarchy of the interaction becomes unclear, and human beings strongly dislike unclear hierarchies because the brain naturally seeks stability in social structure. When people cannot determine their position relative to someone else, they begin attempting to restore clarity. This is why individuals often escalate their behavior when they are ignored. They repeat their criticism. They add stronger language. They try humor, sarcasm, or public pressure. Each attempt is an unconscious effort to force a reaction that will finally reveal your position. But every failed attempt deepens the ambiguity. The person expected a quick emotional signal that would confirm their dominance in the moment. Instead, they encounter composure and distance. And that composure quietly changes how the interaction feels. Your silence creates the possibility that you are not avoiding the interaction out of weakness, but simply choosing not to engage with it. That possibility begins to affect the way people around you perceive the dynamic as well. Observers rarely analyze situations in detail. They rely on visible cues. When they see someone pushing aggressively for a reaction while the other person remains calm and unaffected, they instinctively start questioning who actually holds the stronger position. The person who appears desperate for acknowledgement slowly begins losing credibility, while the silent individual appears controlled and emotionally disciplined. None of this requires direct confrontation or verbal dominance. It happens quietly through the manipulation of expectation. Most provocateurs expect predictable reactions. They expect anger, defense, or argument. When those patterns fail to appear, the structure of the interaction becomes unstable for them. They start trying harder to resolve the uncertainty they created, but each additional attempt makes their effort more visible. Meanwhile, your position remains undefined, and that undefined status becomes its own form of psychological leverage. Machiavelli once said, "Men judge more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see but few can truly perceive." In other words, perception often matters more than explanation. When you remain calm while others struggle to provoke you, people interpret that composure as a sign of internal authority. And authority rarely needs to announce itself loudly. It reveals itself through restraint. Status ambiguity works because the human mind instinctively tries to organize people into clear levels of influence. When someone cannot determine your level, they begin adjusting their own behavior in an attempt to solve the puzzle. But the more they push, the more their own position begins to drop. In the end, the individual who remained silent never had to argue for respect. The silence itself forced others to reconsider the hierarchy. Drop this affirmation in the comments. My silence commands respect. Number 3. The invisible wall. Most people believe strength appears through confrontation. They assume authority means speaking louder, arguing harder, and proving their point until the other person gives up. In many situations, this instinct feels natural because it seems active and decisive. But confrontation also creates something very predictable. It creates a visible battlefield. The moment you begin arguing, both sides clearly understand the structure of the interaction. There are attacks and defenses, accusations and counter-arguments, pressure and response. Every move invites another move. The conflict becomes a game with rules that both participants recognize. And once you enter that structure, you are no longer controlling the environment. You are participating inside it. But strategic silence introduces something completely different. Instead of visible resistance, the other person encounters something they cannot clearly define. Imagine someone pushing against a door expecting it to open, only to discover it does not move. They push harder. Still, nothing happens. They try again with more force. Yet the door remains completely still. Eventually, frustration replaces confidence because the expected reaction never arrives. Psychologically, ignoring provocation works in a similar way. Instead of giving the other person an argument to engage with, you present an invisible barrier. They push with criticism. There is no emotional movement. They push with sarcasm. Still no reaction. They try embarrassment or social pressure. Yet the calm silence remains unchanged. At first, this absence of engagement feels confusing to the person attempting to provoke you. They expected resistance. They expected an exchange. But instead, they face something they cannot interact with. The human brain relies on feedback to navigate social situations. Without feedback, it struggles to understand what is happening. That is why the invisible wall becomes increasingly frustrating the longer it remains in place. The provocateur begins escalating their behavior in an effort to break through the barrier. Their voice may become louder, their language may become sharper, their emotional tone may grow more intense, but every escalation only reveals something important. They are now trying harder than you are. This reversal changes the emotional weight of the situation. The person pushing for engagement begins appearing unstable, while the silent individual appears composed and grounded. What makes the invisible wall powerful is that it removes the reward that provocateurs seek. Many people provoke others because the reaction itself is satisfying. It gives them confirmation that they successfully affected someone. It gives them emotional stimulation and attention. But when their words collide with silence, that reward disappears completely. Instead of excitement, they experience irritation. Instead of satisfaction, they encounter confusion. Over time, the absence of response becomes more uncomfortable than any argument could have been. And this discomfort begins influencing their behavior in ways they did not anticipate. Some individuals eventually abandon the interaction entirely because the invisible wall makes the effort feel pointless. Others become visibly frustrated because they cannot force the reaction they expected. Either way, the dynamic shifts quietly in your favor. You didn't need to raise your voice. You didn't need to defend yourself. The absence of reaction created the barrier that protected your psychological position. Machiavelli once said, "The wise man does at once what the fool does finally." In many confrontations, the fool reacts immediately while the strategist observes patiently. Silence often feels passive to people who equate power with aggression. But controlled silence is not passivity. It is deliberate restraint. It is the ability to recognize when engagement would only strengthen the other person's position. The invisible wall teaches something important about social influence. Not every challenge deserves participation. Some situations gain power only when you step inside them. By refusing to engage, you deny the conflict the oxygen it needs to continue. The other person may push repeatedly, hoping to find an opening in your composure. But if the wall remains firm, their effort eventually exposes itself as unnecessary noise. And when people realize they are pushing against something that refuses to move, they often begin exhausting their own emotional energy long before they affect yours. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. Calm is my shield. Number 4. Delayed psychological gravity. Most confrontations follow a pattern that feels almost automatic. Someone says something provocative. The other person reacts immediately. Words are exchanged, emotions rise, and eventually the interaction reaches some form of closure. It might end with one person walking away, a temporary agreement, or simple exhaustion. But the key element in this pattern is speed. The reaction happens quickly, and that speed allows the mind to resolve the moment almost instantly. Even if the exchange was uncomfortable, the brain files it away as finished business. The situation becomes part of the past. This is exactly why many provocateurs expect an immediate response. Quick reactions create quick endings. But silence disrupts this entire psychological structure. When you refuse to respond, the natural sequence of provocation and reaction suddenly breaks apart. The interaction doesn't reach closure. Instead, it becomes unfinished. And the human mind struggles deeply with unfinished situations. Psychologists often describe this effect as a mental loop. When something remains unresolved, the brain keeps returning to it repeatedly, searching for meaning or explanation. Silence creates that loop. The person who expected a reaction suddenly finds themselves carrying an unanswered moment inside their mind. They replay what they said. They imagine possible interpretations of your silence. They begin questioning their own assumptions. Did they ignore me intentionally? Did I misjudge their reaction? Should I have said something different? Each time the mind revisits the situation, the emotional weight of the moment grows slightly heavier. What originally lasted only a few seconds now occupies far more mental space than it ever would have if you had reacted immediately. This is where delayed psychological gravity begins to take effect. Think of gravity as a force that slowly pulls objects toward a center. In social interaction, unresolved silence acts in a similar way. The longer the silence remains, the more attention it attracts inside the other person's mind. The brain naturally tries to finish incomplete experiences. Without closure, the moment lingers like an unanswered question. Ironically, the person who tried to provoke you may end up thinking about the situation far more than you ever did. Instead of moving forward with their day, their thoughts keep drifting back to the silence they encountered. The longer this delay continues, the more the meaning of your silence begins expanding in their imagination. People often fill unanswered spaces with their own interpretations. Some begin assuming you ignored them because you consider them insignificant. Others suspect that you understood the provocation but chose not to engage because you hold a stronger psychological position. Some even start worrying that their behavior appeared foolish or unnecessary in front of others. None of these conclusions require you to say a single word. The silence itself allows their own mind to generate the interpretations. This is why delayed psychological gravity can quietly reverse the emotional weight of an interaction. What began as a quick attempt to provoke you slowly becomes a lingering question inside their thoughts. Instead of controlling the moment, they become trapped, analyzing it. Instead of affecting your emotions, they begin wrestling with their own uncertainty. Machiavelli once said, "Men are driven more by the fear of uncertainty than by the certainty of loss." Uncertainty has a unique influence on human thinking. Clear outcomes, even negative ones, allow the brain to move forward. But unresolved situations create tension that the mind repeatedly tries to resolve. Strategic silence uses that natural tendency without force or aggression. By refusing to react immediately, you remove the instant resolution that the provocateur expected. The interaction stops moving forward and begins orbiting inside their thoughts instead. Meanwhile, your own mental energy remains untouched because you never entered the emotional exchange. Time quietly becomes your ally. The longer the silence lasts, the heavier the unresolved moment becomes for the other person. Eventually, they may attempt to revisit the situation themselves in order to find closure. They might change their tone, soften their approach, or pretend the original provocation never happened. In many cases, the person who tried to provoke you will begin seeking acknowledgement from you simply to relieve the tension created by the unanswered moment. What began as their attempt to control the interaction slowly turns into their attempt to escape it. Number 5. Provocation exposure. When someone attempts to provoke you, they usually believe they are being clever. Their words are often designed to appear subtle at first. The tone might sound casual, the insult disguised as humor, the criticism wrapped in sarcasm. The intention is not always obvious in the beginning. In fact, many provocateurs rely on ambiguity because it gives them protection. If you react strongly, they can easily pretend you misunderstood them. They can claim they were just joking or that you're being overly sensitive. This tactic allows them to provoke while maintaining the appearance of innocence. But this strategy depends on one very important element: your reaction. The moment you respond emotionally, the focus shifts away from their behavior and toward your response. People around you stop examining the original provocation and start observing the argument itself. The discussion becomes about who reacted more strongly rather than who initiated the tension. In other words, the provocateur hides behind your reaction. However, when you refuse to respond, the entire structure of this tactic collapses. Instead of shifting attention to your emotional reaction, the spotlight remains exactly where it started, on their behavior. Silence creates space, and that space allows others to observe what is actually happening. When someone tries to provoke and receives no response, they rarely stop immediately. Their plan depended on engagement, so when that engagement fails to appear, they often escalate their efforts. The comments become sharper, the tone becomes more obvious, the sarcasm becomes louder. What began as subtle provocation slowly transforms into visible agitation. This escalation exposes something they were originally trying to hide: their intention. Observers begin noticing a clear contrast. One person remains calm and composed. The other person continues pushing harder for attention. Without you accusing them, without you confronting them directly, their own behavior reveals the truth of the situation. The more they escalate, the more visible their motives become. And visibility is dangerous for anyone who relies on manipulation. People generally tolerate small moments of tension, but they quickly lose respect for someone who appears obsessed with provoking conflict. The provocateur unknowingly creates their own reputation in real time. Meanwhile, your silence protects your position. Because you never reacted emotionally, your credibility remains intact. Your calm presence sends a message without words. It communicates that you refuse to be dragged into unnecessary conflict. It communicates discipline, restraint, and psychological stability. Over time, people begin associating these qualities with strength. The contrast between your composure and the other person's escalating behavior quietly reshapes how the interaction is perceived. Instead of appearing as someone defending yourself, you appear as someone who simply refused to participate in an immature game. This shift in perception is extremely powerful. Social dynamics are influenced heavily by observation. People form opinions based not only on what is said, but on how individuals behave under pressure. When someone repeatedly attempts to provoke while the other person remains calm, the audience begins forming its own conclusions. The provocateur appears insecure. The silent individual appears controlled. And this reversal happens naturally without any direct confrontation. Machiavelli once said, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him." In other words, people reveal their character through their behavior. When someone escalates provocation in front of others, they reveal more about themselves than any accusation ever could. Strategic silence allows that revelation to happen without interference. Instead of arguing with the provocateur, you allow their actions to speak loudly enough on their own. And actions often carry far more credibility than words. Eventually, the provocateur reaches an uncomfortable realization. Their attempts to provoke have not created the reaction they expected. Instead, those attempts have made their own intentions visible. What was meant to undermine you ends up weakening their own image. This is the quiet power of provocation exposure. You do not defeat the tactic through confrontation. You defeat it by removing the reaction that gives it life. Without that reaction, the manipulation becomes visible for everyone to see. And once people see it clearly, it loses its effectiveness entirely. Now, I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. Truth reveals itself. Number 6. Authority through emotional immunity. One of the clearest signals of real authority is not dominance, intelligence, or even confidence. It is emotional immunity. Emotional immunity means that your internal state cannot be easily influenced by external pressure. Most people believe authority comes from speaking strongly, proving a point, or demonstrating power through visible action. But the human mind often interprets authority in a much quieter way. People instinctively watch how someone behaves when they are challenged. They observe reactions, they observe emotional shifts, they observe whether a person becomes unstable under pressure, and these observations shape how much influence that person appears to have. When someone can be easily provoked, others unconsciously register that vulnerability. It does not matter how intelligent or articulate they are. If a small insult can trigger anger, if criticism quickly triggers defense, or if sarcasm immediately causes irritation, the brain notices something important. This person's emotions can be moved from the outside. Once people realize that your emotional state can be controlled by external pressure, your psychological authority begins to weaken. It signals that others have access to your reactions. But emotional immunity creates the opposite impression. When someone attempts to provoke you and nothing happens, the moment becomes psychologically unusual. The expected emotional movement does not appear. There is no frustration in your voice, no visible irritation in your face, and no defensive explanation in your words. Instead, there is stillness. This stillness sends a powerful message without needing to be spoken. It suggests that your emotional center exists outside the reach of the provocation, and the human mind interprets this distance as strength. Think about the difference between two individuals in a tense moment. One reacts immediately, speaking louder and faster as emotions rise. The other remains calm, speaking slowly or not responding at all. Even if both individuals have equal intelligence, observers naturally begin assigning greater authority to the calm individual. Why? Because calm behavior under pressure suggests internal stability. It suggests that the person has control over themselves before attempting to control anything else. Emotional immunity also disrupts the expectations of those who try to provoke you. Many provocateurs rely on predictable emotional patterns. They expect anger, frustration, or embarrassment. These reactions provide the emotional reward they are seeking. But when none of these signals appear, the provocateur begins questioning their strategy. They may attempt stronger insults. They may increase their intensity. But every attempt that fails reinforces the same realization. Their influence is not reaching you. And once someone realizes they cannot easily affect your emotions, their confidence begins to weaken. They start adjusting their behavior around you. Some become more cautious, others become quieter. The interaction begins shifting without you needing to assert dominance directly. This is the subtle effect of emotional immunity. It reshapes behavior through perception rather than confrontation. People instinctively respect individuals who appear difficult to disturb. This respect does not come from fear alone. It comes from the recognition of control. A person who controls their own emotions appears capable of controlling situations as well. Machiavelli once said, "He who wishes to be obeyed must know how to command." But true command begins with the ability to command yourself. When you master your emotional responses, you demonstrate a level of discipline that many people struggle to maintain. That discipline becomes visible in moments of tension. Others notice that their words do not shake you. Their criticism does not push you into defense. Their attempts at provocation simply pass through your presence without leaving a mark. Over time, this pattern creates a reputation. People begin expecting that you will remain calm regardless of circumstances, and expectations shape behavior. Once individuals believe they cannot easily provoke you, they stop attempting it as often. Emotional immunity therefore does more than protect your internal state. It changes how people approach you in the first place. They become more careful with their words. They become more respectful in their tone. And this shift happens quietly, without confrontation or force. The calm individual gradually becomes the stable center in situations where others lose composure. In social dynamics, stability attracts influence. People trust those who remain grounded when tension rises, because stability signals reliability, and reliability often becomes the foundation of authority. Number 7. The silence reversal. At the beginning of a provocation, the person who starts the interaction usually believes they control the situation. They spoke first. They created the tension. They introduced the emotional pressure. From their perspective, the next step is predictable. They expect you to respond. They expect you to defend yourself, challenge them, or react emotionally. In their mind, the interaction has already begun moving in a direction they understand. They believe they're steering the moment. But silence quietly interrupts that expectation. When you refuse to respond, the direction of attention begins to shift in a subtle but powerful way. Instead of watching your reaction, the provocateur begins waiting for one. At first, they remain confident. They assume your response is simply delayed. Perhaps you are thinking about what to say. Perhaps you are preparing a stronger reply. But as the silence continues, their confidence begins to weaken. The reaction they expected does not arrive. The psychological control they believed they had over the situation starts slipping away. The interaction slowly enters unfamiliar territory for them. Instead of observing your emotions, they begin wondering about their own position. Did they push too far? Did their words fall flat? Did others notice the silence? Attention begins drifting away from you and turning inward toward their own uncertainty. This shift creates what can be called the silence reversal. The dynamic that originally placed you under pressure quietly flips. The person who tried to provoke you now finds themselves waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for confirmation that their words mattered. waiting for any signal that the interaction they started still exists. But because you remain silent, they cannot easily obtain that confirmation. Without realizing it, they begin chasing the very thing they expected you to give them automatically: attention. This reversal is psychologically significant. In most social interactions, the individual seeking attention occupies the lower position in the dynamic. The person who appears emotionally invested in receiving acknowledgement often loses perceived influence. Meanwhile, the individual who controls their attention appears independent and stable. Silence therefore becomes a quiet filter. It reveals who truly needs the interaction and who does not. The provocateur begins realizing something uncomfortable. They wanted to control the conversation, but now they are the one waiting for validation. They may try to fill the silence themselves by speaking again. They may attempt humor to soften the moment. They may change the subject entirely. All of these behaviors share the same underlying motivation: restoring balance to a dynamic that suddenly feels uneven. The silence created a psychological vacuum, and people naturally try to fill vacuums with action or words. Meanwhile, you remain outside the emotional turbulence of the interaction. Because you never reacted, the situation never gained emotional momentum on your side. Your calm distance forces the other person to carry the entire weight of the interaction alone. Over time, this imbalance becomes uncomfortable for them. What originally felt like control slowly begins feeling like exposure. Their attempt to provoke now appears unnecessary or awkward. Observers begin noticing the difference as well. One person appears patient and unaffected. The other appears increasingly eager for a response. This contrast quietly reshapes the perception of the moment. Machiavelli once said, "The one who controls the frame controls the outcome." Silence allows you to control the frame of the interaction without speaking. By refusing to enter the emotional structure the other person created, you force them to exist inside it alone. The frame collapses because it requires two participants to sustain it. Without your engagement, the provocateur begins experiencing their own strategy turning against them. They become the one seeking closure. They become the one seeking attention. They become the one hoping for acknowledgement. And that reversal changes everything. The interaction no longer belongs to the person who started it. It belongs to the person who decides whether it deserves attention at all. Silence therefore becomes a final form of control. Not control through dominance, but control through selection. You choose whether the interaction continues. You choose whether the words deserve recognition. And in many cases, the most powerful decision is simply allowing the moment to fade without ever giving it the reaction it was designed to extract. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I control attention. Most people spend their entire lives reacting to criticism, reacting to insults, reacting to every small provocation that crosses their path. And without realizing it, they give away the most valuable psychological resource they possess, their attention. Because attention is power. Where your attention goes, your emotional energy follows.